Odeta Kushi is the VP and Deputy Chief Economist at First American Financial Corporation. She's also prominent on LinkedIn, where she analyzes housing and mortgage market trends for industry professionals and consumers alike. On top of that, she's a prominent thought leader and co-host of First American's Our Economy content, frequently breaking down housing data, affordability, and market dynamics in accessible, story-driven messaging. Odeta, thank you for joining me.
It's great to be here.
Thank you. So normally for Powerhouse, it's more conversational, and I don't ask specific questions, but since we're here at the Housing Economic Summit, I wanted to try something a little bit differently with a kind of a fixed set of questions. And before we dive into those, I wanted to see if we could set a kind of a foundational approach to housing economics, because I feel like people that don't swim in these waters every day, they see housing economics more like a mechanism versus an organism. Mm-hmm. And correct me if I'm wrong or tweak my metaphor a little bit, but I feel like housing economics is more like an organism, because if in a mechanism, you have, when all inputs are known, you have like a fixed outcome. Mm-hmm. And in economics and housing economics, there are all of these factors that are constantly at play, that are constantly changing and that are unknown. And that can be everything from local policy to consumer sentiment. Is that a fair assessment? Is that a fair metaphor?
I think that's absolutely fair. I mean, when we think about housing, interest rates come to mind, but that's just one piece of the puzzle. Housing is at the intersection of all parts of our economy. Obviously, the labor market, you mentioned consumer confidence. When people are transacting, buying and selling homes, this is often the largest financial decision of their lives. And so they need to feel strong about their labor market prospects, about, that make sure they're gainfully employed and feeling good. And so all of these different pieces, the labor market, consumer health, consumer spending, consumer confidence, obviously interest rates and broader macroeconomic factors, local market conditions, regulations, policy, all of these play into housing market and our outlook for the housing market. And so it is constantly changing and evolving in that way.
Okay, perfect. So I've got a fixed set of questions I'm going to ask you, and I'm going to ask a few other housing economists, later today. And I think that'll serve kind of as a platform to illustrate the way that you view the market and interpret any relevant data science versus the other economists. So you ready?
Okay, I'm
excellent.
ready.
Okay, so when we talk about housing economics, for housing professionals that are out interacting with home buyers and referral partners, what are the handful of core forces or metrics that like LOs and even agents should really focus on to understand? I'm sure you're familiar with the Pareto principle, like the 80-20 rule.
Of course.
Okay, so to understand 80% of the market story, what core 20% of factors or data points do you think people should focus on?
Well, so, oftentimes we talk about interest rates, but rather than say, well, understand interest rates, I think it's important to understand the drivers of interest rates. So when people are asking me, where do you think interest rates are going to go? It's very challenging to forecast interest rates because it's a function of so many different factors. So I tend to take a step back and say, well, let's look at inflation and let's look at the labor market, because that has implications for what the Federal Reserve is going to do and ultimately what will happen with mortgage rates. And so when we talk about the interest rate piece, I say look at inflation measures and the labor market dynamics to try and get a better understanding of where that might be headed. Inventory, obviously, I think high frequency inventory measures weekly, if you can get it, to try and understand sort of where we're headed when it comes to inventory. You can't buy what's not for sale. And so I always think it's important to have a good pulse and then to understand the nuances, because when we talk about active inventory, that's sort of your stock measure. So you can have growing active inventory because markets are staying on the market longer because people aren't buying, and so they're kind of piling up month after month. But then new listings, that's sort of I think of it in a bathtub metaphor, right? So you have like the stock of active inventory in the water in the tub, and then new listings are what's flowing in. We find that that's a better predictor of sales activity. So in markets where new inventory is growing, that tends to be where we're seeing higher sales activity as well. So I think inventory is the other piece of it. And then taking a step step back, it's always demographics. When I approach forecasting, when I approach how we look at the outlook for the housing market, I always come back to fundamentals, and demographic trends are a big piece of that. So what's happening with population growth, what's happening with migration, looking at various generations and whether they're aging in or aging out of homeownership. And so we're always keeping a beat on that as well. So there certainly are more beyond that, but I would say, the drivers of interest rate dynamics, of which there are a lot, but right now we're looking at inflation and labor market dynamics, inventory measures, and then demographics.
What are some important or interesting demographic trends that you're seeing right now?
That's a great question. So we still think that there's a housing market tailwind from millennials aging into their prime home buying years. Millennials are a really interesting generation. They're the largest living generation at the moment. And what we find in the data is that they're making these lifestyle decisions that are highly correlated with buying a home, like getting married and having kids. They're doing it later than their generational predecessors. And so we're finding in the data that when you look at the 30-year-old millennial and you compare their homeownership rate to the 30-year-old Gen Xer, the 30-year-old baby boomer, their homeownership rate's like 6 percentage points behind their generational predecessors. But as evidence of the trend I just mentioned, when you look at the 42-year-old millennial, their homeownership rate gap goes away with the Gen Xer. And I think that's evidence of this trend that millennials are interested in buying homes. They are buying homes, they're just doing it later in life.
So do you think that's a affordability issue or like a maturation issue?
I think it's a little bit of both. I do think that the affordability constraints that we've faced in the last couple of years have been particularly acute in keeping some buyers on the sidelines. But we're also seeing that millennials are staying in school longer and they're prioritizing their education, which is ultimately yielding higher incomes. And they're pushing these lifestyle decisions, which is also pushing the decision to become a homeowner further along in life. But their homeownership rate is just over 50%. There's a lot of them, and there are a bunch of them still on the sidelines waiting to jump into the housing market. And I think that this is a tailwind for housing demand. But then on the other side of the generations, you have baby boomers. And the population of 80 plus is expected to about double between now and 2040. I know there's been a lot of mention of like silver tsunami all of that, right? I think it's more like a silver glacier, right? Demographic trends move slowly. So we'll see people age out of homeownership rather over time. And I think there will be a lot more of that. Certainly in the 2030s, we'll see it start to pick up speed. And baby boomers own a lot of homes in prime locations. They will need some work to be made, to sort of renovate them so that they're interesting to the next generation of buyers. But there's a lot of them, and that'll add some more supply to the market as we look out, further horizon.
I spent quite a few years in the reverse space as well. So like the silver tsunami thing, and they've been selling that for 10, 12 years, I think, at this point.
Yes, and the tsunami by its very nature is pretty fast moving.
Yeah, it's a glacier. If it's anything, it's a glacier.
Yes.
So, right. Okay, so and you touched on some of this, but when looking at shifts to predict buyer demand and affordability, what are key indicators specifically for buyer demand and affordability that professionals should be on the lookout for?
Yeah, so buyer demand, obviously all the listings data that I know Mike Simonson's here today, and he'll be talking a little bit about those metrics and what we're seeing. I always come back to you can't buy what's not for sale, so you need to have healthy inventory levels to see sales activity happen. From affordability, I'm optimistic this year because even if mortgage rates stay where they're at, right, even if they sort of hover between the 6 to 6.2% range, what we've been seeing is that income growth has been outpacing house price growth. And that's allowed affordability to slowly come into better balance.
When you say outpacing, do you mean within the last couple of years? Because over a span of 30 years, it hasn't, right?
So longer time horizons, not so much. But since, in the second half of 2025 is when we start to see our data show that house price growth, because now our First American Data and Analytics House Price Index is showing that house price growth is at the slowest pace since 2012. So it's below 1%, still positive, but below 1%. And that while income growth is stronger. And so that's allowed affordability to improve. We've actually seen the best affordability levels in over 3 years. That's a function of the dynamic I just mentioned, income growth outpacing house price growth. It's also a factor of mortgage rates have come down. So that's been helping as well. But even if mortgage rates stay flat, if that dynamic persists, we'll still get some slow affordability gains.
If you could teach let's just say mortgage professional, not keep real estate out of it. If you could teach a mortgage professional one economic concept to be well versed in, what would it be?
Wow, that's a great question. A lot of things are coming to mind. One economic concept. There's a lot. I mean, my mind is going to some sort of behavioral economics concepts like anchoring and recency bias, right? So we saw when mortgage rates started to climb, and they climbed very fast, and that was really the issue, is the rate of change going from such a low mortgage rate to a high mortgage rate. But we're subject to some anchoring biases, which is that we were just used to this low mortgage rate environment, 3% mortgage rates, and so suddenly that's sort of the new normal. Yeah. And we keep anchoring to that period in time as normal. But that's the exception to the rule, right? Historically, mortgage rates have been above 6% if you look at the historical average. And so we're not too far above, average in terms of mortgage rates. The bigger issue is not just the fact that mortgage rates are 6%, it's that they went up from such a low base, and also that they're in combination with very, very high house prices, historically high house prices. And that's really what's been contributing to the affordability environment that we find ourselves in. Beyond that, I think the bathtub analogy that I mentioned earlier, I do think that that's an important nuance that is sometimes missed when we track inventory data, is this active versus new inventory distinction, because active inventory can pile up. I think it was just mentioned in one of the talks, maybe Logan mentioned it, that when interest rates go up, we tend to see inventory increase. And part of that is a function of, people are sort of waiting on the sidelines a little bit more. So, inventory is piling up, days on market is increasing. New inventory is the water flowing into the bathtub. So it's how many people are deciding to list their homes. And I think that that distinction is important to make as well.
So how do you view the current supply and demand balance? And is there a threshold that's indicating that it's normalized, it's healthy, it's unhealthy? What is your perspective there?
I think we're moving in the right direction, and I see 2026 as being a year where we continue to sort of move in the right direction. We've been in this environment where we did see inventory increase last year, which was good news. Demand has been a little bit hesitant, right? Because the payment to paycheck calculation, as I call it, just hasn't made sense for a lot of potential buyers. But right now, we're starting the year with higher inventory levels than a year ago. We're seeing affordability start the year in a better spot. Mortgage rates are lower than they were a year ago. I think there's maybe a bit more certainty this year in the market. Buyers are feeling, I know consumer confidence levels are still quite low, but we're seeing mortgage applications respond to this environment. Mortgage applications are starting the year higher than year-ago levels, which I think bodes well for purchase demand.
What do you think is the most important factor when it comes to affordability, or perhaps like perceived affordability? Like you were talking about that wages have finally increased relative to home prices. Beyond that, is it rates? And I don't, when I say perceived affordability, like you were talking about recency bias, right? So if rates were to drop down to 4%, whether or not they might be jumping into something that they could still afford at 5%, right?
Right.
But because rates have dropped down to 4%, they're going to try to get on those lower rates. So what do you see as the most important factors, actual affordability or perceived affordability?
That's a great question. And actually, as you were saying that, I thought of maybe another factor of something that I would want to explain, which is it's really hard to time the market, right? And I think it's sometimes a fool's errand to try and time the market, because maybe mortgage rates dip below 6%, but in supply-constrained markets, that decline in mortgage rates can show up in the form of higher house prices, right? So you might capture the market on one end of things, you got a lower mortgage rate, but maybe you got into a bidding war, and the price of that house went up. And so it's just really difficult, I think, to time the market. So the best time to buy is really when you find a house that you like, so the inventory is sufficient, when it meets your sort of monthly payment, what you can afford to buy from a monthly payment perspective, and it fits your lifestyle needs. And those three factors, I think, are really what would drive the decision to buy and sell a home. And so to your point about perceived or actual affordability, I do think it comes down to maybe perceived affordability sort of gets you interested, but it's actual affordability that drives the market forward.
Yeah, I think Logan has a couple key phrases that he tools around with, but
Yeah.
one of is basically homeowners. He just says homeowners are just different, man. Homeowners are going to home own, like they're going to get into a home if they want. If they're ready to get into a home, they're going to get into a home.
Absolutely. If your lifestyle needs are such that you want to move from renting to buying, or you just had another kid and you've outgrown your space, and there's a home that meets your requirements and you can afford to buy it. I think we're already starting to see those types of lifestyle decisions drive the market forward, despite the fact that we have a substantial number of homeowners that are rate locked into their homes. You're still seeing those folks make the decision to part with a 3% mortgage rate in favor of moving on with their lives and buying a home that meets their needs.
Right. So, touching back on what you had said previously about timing the market, or the difficulty of timing the market, how should professionals think about the relationship between rates, home prices, inventory? Like, what's either the lag time or like the feedback loop that they tend to forget or overlook?
So I would say, I always think about the fact that there are trade-offs here. Affordability, there's different levers. There's income, there's mortgage rates, and there's home prices. And home prices are really a function of supply and demand dynamics. So we have markets right now where inventory has sort of piled up. Florida, Texas, markets that are a little bit more builder-friendly, where when interest rates came down, builders started to pick up the pace, and then when interest rates went up, maybe there was a pullback in demand, and so you've had more inventory start to pile up. So if mortgage rates come down in these markets where active inventory has piled up, maybe you don't get as much of a price response. So prices don't increase as fast because there's plenty of supply to be absorbed. But when we look at regional dynamics, the Northeast, the Midwest, these are places where building hasn't kept pace, and so we're still seeing inventory more historically constrained. I went to school in the Boston area, and that could be one area where if mortgage rates come down and you get a bunch of people off the sidelines, then maybe you start to see home prices pick up and home price growth pick up, reflecting that sort of surge in demand, not meeting insufficient supply. And so I think you've got to keep regional dynamics in mind, and also keep in mind, well, is this an area that has enough supply to absorb that inflow of demand from the lower rates, or is it an area where inventory hasn't quite kept pace, and so you'll start to see house prices react.
Right. How do you recommend people begin to span the gap or that chasm between the macro and the micro? So if you're an agent, if you're a loan originator, then your market is local. It's a micro market, right? And and a lot of there's just misperception, I believe, that's obviously you need to know your local market because that's where all of your money is, that's where all your business is. But on the local news at night, they're not showing. There's not a segment over your regional housing market, right? People, home buyers and potential home buyers, they're looking at national news. They're receiving information about the macro view, not the micro. So how do you recommend that professionals begin to connect the dots? Because the divergence from local community, regional divergences from one market to the other can be vast.
Absolutely.
Right, so how do they connect those dots, and then what are some initial first steps they could do? Just because I know that's a complicated answer to unpack. So what are some first steps that they could do to connect the macro to the micro, and then begin to filter out that information to the home buyer?
Yeah, so there are trends that I think are more universal, right? So when we look at what the Fed's doing and what interest rates are doing, that tends to flow through to all markets. Interest rates are either going up or they're going down. And so there are some things that are relevant to everyone. But beyond that, I think there are so many great data providers out there right now, HousingWire being one, that are offering data at the hyper-local market level. And so if you know what to track, some of the things that we've already talked about, looking at inventory metrics and listings data and labor market data, if you know what to track, there's a lot of data available to you, and you can start to tease out like, oh, well, my market's diverging significantly from the national because the national unemployment rate has actually increased to 4.5%, whereas in my local market we continue to grow and we're getting a lot of domestic net in-migration and jobs are growing, and so that has strong implications for our local housing demand. If more people are moving in, that's more demand for shelter, both rented and owned. And so I think it's utilizing a lot of those available data resources to try and understand what's happening in your local market, because to your point, it's not always, what's happening at the national isn't always particularly relevant to your market. But I'm glad we're living in a time when there's so much data available to all of us to try and understand some of these regional dynamics.
I'm glad you brought that up. I've got a specific question about that.
There we go.
Not yet. I'm going to get to it in a second. So demographic and behavioral trends like household formation, the shift to remote work, how much of that is still a major factor in the current market overall?
Yeah, you cannot put that genie back in the bottle, right? We now have the ability to work remotely, and I think while you might and we are seeing people move back to the office and there's these hybrid environments, I really don't see us going back to a pre-pandemic world where we're all back in the office. And so I think that still impacts housing market dynamics. We did see the shift out to the suburbs in the aftermath of the pandemic. I think part of that was driven by the ability to work remotely, but I think part of that was driven by demographic trends. We were seeing that precede the pandemic, and that's really millennials aging into their prime home buying years, forming families, and doing what their predecessors had done before them, which is move out to the suburbs and start their families. And so that's a trend that continues. And then Gen Z now is sort of aging into moving to the downtown urban core, renting, so we'll see some of that demand as well from the Gen Zers. So it's always take a step back and look at what the demographics are telling you. I certainly think that remote work is still influencing trends today, and you still see people that maybe worked in California and now Texas offers them relative affordability, and so they're able to move and buy a home with a little bit more land. I still think that those dynamics are impacting our market.
You explain all of these factors and the relationship between the data points really well in plain English, well enough for me to be able to understand it.
Okay,
so how do you recommend? I think that's a struggle for a lot of people, is that they will get lost in the industry or the topic-specific jargon, and then that really gets lost on the home buyer, on the customer. How do you approach translating these things into language that's relatable and understandable? And what advice would you give for someone wanting to do that?
This is something I think that as economists, we've all had to learn along the way. And for me, it starts with what matters to people. And in fact, sometimes I'll be working on an analysis and I'll be really in the weeds of it. And I'll turn to my husband and I'll say, like, what questions do you have about the housing market? Like what matters to you? Or I'll ask a friend, like, what are you curious about? What's perplexing to you? What don't you understand? But really it starts from a place of like, why does this matter to a consumer, to a broker? What does all of our research matter? And I start from that point and use that as sort of my launching pad to explain these various dynamics is really what matters to people on a day-to-day.
Right. What's one misconception about housing data or economics that you wish that the industry would move past?
Misconception. There's quite a few. From a consumer standpoint, we're always trying to disrupt the myth of the 20% down payment.
Oh yeah.
That's always been a challenge for potential first-time home buyers. Is there's this idea that you always need to put down 20% on your first home, and even a lot of in my own friend group, I think that's been a challenge to overcome, that there's options for putting down less than 20%. Shopping around for a mortgage rate, that's the other That's the other one that I always think of with the consumer that we typically get is you're able to shop around for a mortgage rate, and there's been plenty of studies to show that if you do that and you put in that time and that effort, you can land on a much lower mortgage rate than if you just go than if you don't shop around. But I generally do think that there's a big misconception on timing the market. There was a big push for what was the phrase, like
date the rate, marry the house.
Date the rate, marry the house, and a lot of misconception around like, well, it's okay, you can always refi, you can always refi. Traditionally, that's been true. I mean, we've been in a 30-year plus declining mortgage rate environment that's really contributed to quite a bit of turnover, right? You could buy your house in 1981 at an 18% mortgage rate, and then a couple years later you refi, and then you get into your next house, and then you refi, and that's really been a big tailwind for our industry. And I think we're sort of in a new environment right now.
Yeah, we've only got like a couple year window where that actually is relevant again.
Exactly. I'm not seeing that as being in our near-term future, and so I wouldn't necessarily give that advice of well, buy and then you can refi a couple years later. No, I mean, buy and make sure you're comfortable with the monthly payment, that you like the house, all those things we already talked about. And maybe eventually you can refi and that's great, but I wouldn't use that as pushing the boundaries on what you can afford, right? And so I just think we're in a different housing market. It's been like this when you look at mortgage rates, and now I think we're sort of stabilizing at a historically normal mortgage rate, but now we need house prices and incomes to help bring affordability back to reasonable.
What either risks or vulnerabilities in the housing market give you pause, or I don't exaggerate too much, but like keep you up at night, or are concerning to you? And it can be structural, policy related, financial.
There's a couple of things. I mean, we've been talking a lot more about rising insurance premiums. So non-mortgage costs are something that I think about a lot, because they're not just an issue to potential home buyers, they're also a problem for existing homeowners, especially those on fixed incomes. Even those who have paid off their mortgages, right? Facing rising insurance premium costs, property taxes, all of these things can be financially burdensome to existing homeowners and potential home buyers. So I think about that a lot. I've been thinking a lot about the labor market. We started the conversation talking about how housing is at the intersection of all these different parts of our economy, and the labor market is one area that I'm monitoring, because some of the presentations today went over this in great detail, but the labor market, the unemployment rate is still historically low. So on the face of it, it doesn't seem like things are problematic. But then when you look at the hiring rate in today's labor market, it's at about the same level as it was in 2013, which is when the unemployment rate was 7%. So there's not a ton of hiring happening. We're not firing, like we're not seeing these widespread layoffs in the labor market, but we're also not hiring, so it's frozen. And job changes are a trigger for home changes, for transactions, right? That tend to be one of the bigger triggers for household moves. And so if you don't have a ton of hiring happening in the labor market, then that has direct implications to the housing market. But also, if we do start to see layoffs pick up and we don't have enough job openings and hires to absorb those layoffs, then that has broader implications as well. And we're already seeing foreclosures tick up a little bit. I expect that with a cooling labor market, we'll see more. I am in no way, saying this on the record, looking directly at the camera, no way expecting a foreclosure wave. There are pockets, I think, of the country that will experience some more, especially in areas that, where buyers bought at the top of the market, where those buyers put down very low down payments. I think there's a little bit more stress among those homeowners, but generally speaking, I'm not expecting any sort of foreclosure wave, because we still have pretty strong equity cushions in today's economy. But I am watching the labor market very closely for any signs of stress there.
Okay. So I said I was going to mention it in a few questions, and we're here.
Okay.
So HousingWire, we're rolling out today the HousingWire Intelligence Platform, and it's a customizable dashboard for professionals to understand, visualize, what's happening both at the macro and the micro level, like we talked about a few questions ago. And so if you were to recommend a basic dashboard setup to a loan originator? Let's say a branch or regional manager. Okay. So what 3 to 5 data points would you recommend that they include for a national dashboard, let's say, and then a local dashboard?
Okay. Well,
assuming that HousingWire Intelligence has any and all relevant data that you could wish for.
okay, this is great. And then you'll implement all of these suggestions.
I'm gonna get
if it's not already there.
I want to get an Odeta Kushi, drop down profile that people can just, they can implement your dashboard.
The Odeta Kushi dashboard.
That's what I'm pushing for.
Perfect. So, the obvious one that I'm sure you'll get quite a bit of agreement on is inventory. Mm-hmm. You have to know what's going on with inventory. Affordability, I think an affordability index. And
are we on the macro or the micro?
I would think that this would apply to both,
okay.
but that the affordability index would be hyperlocal. So it would be using local incomes, mm-hmm. right? So instead of using the national median income, it would use the Dallas mm-hmm. Median income to determine affordability. And that affordability index should include or even break out the 3 major pieces of affordability that I mentioned, which is income, interest rates, and house prices. So house prices should be included both at the national level and to the local level, so you know what's going on. A repeat sales index, I think, would be helpful because it removes some of the noise from changing mix, right? Because a median sales price can reflect whether higher priced homes or lower priced homes are being sold. So you need affordability, you need inventory measured in some capacity. I think labor market data would be helpful if we're thinking a one-stop shop, right? Yeah. Of what's happening in my market. Labor market information, I think, would be helpful to have there, both at the national and at the local level. Migration data, mm-hmm. I think, would be helpful. Well, population data, I'll say that. So what's happening in terms of, and population data tends to be lagging. So if you could incorporate more real-time measures, and there are some data sources available out there to try and understand what's happening with inflow and outflow of population trends. I think that would be incredibly useful. Maybe I'm thinking like an economist, like what I would want.
Totally fine.
in that data. So I think that would be important and will help us understand some of the demographic drivers as well. So those things capture sort of the supply and the demand, and then the intersection of supply and demand, which is house prices and what it means for affordability. Right. I think that those would all be really helpful in getting a good view of the market. Okay,
so if you were advising originator again, or a branch manager, regional manager, to watch for 3 leading indicators for 26 going into 2027, 3 leading indicators, what would you pick?
3 leading indicators. Okay, a lot of the macro ones we track are quite lagging, as you know. So on the inventory front, I think new listings are an important one to measure. So how much, how many people are deciding to enter the market and sell their home. I think that's a good one. I do think that the house price indices are somewhat lagging just by the nature of how that they're determined, but I think that's also an important one because it's a good sort of what's happening at the intersection of supply and demand. So I think house prices are the other one. So you've got the supply, you've got the intersection, and then affordability indices. We have one called the Real House Price Index that's tracking affordability using all those factors that we talked about, income, interest rates, and house prices at the metro level. I think that would be another one to be able to talk to potential buyers like, hey, affordability, despite some of the headlines, is at its best level in 3 years, right? And new listings are starting to tick up, or if that was the story in your local market, and that'll give you more options to work with, and so I think I would choose those ones.
Okay, so it wouldn't be a HousingWire interview or content piece in the last 2 years if I didn't at least bring up AI in some form or fashion. So,
of course.
Yeah, so what is your perception, what is your view on the impact? Obviously it's going to be very important, but the way that AI and more transparent data, how is that going to transform the way that people view and understand housing cycles over the next 5 years, in your opinion?
I mean, I think it's incredibly important. I think we're already seeing some evidence of the fact that AI is making us more productive in the way that we can do research, in the way that we can get information quicker, in the way that we ask and receive answers to questions. So I think the productivity gains, there's more to come from that standpoint. And historically, productivity gains, you could see some productivity-led income growth broadly in the market. But I think it'll help consumers get their information faster, get more information. And I see it as a good opportunity for our industry to leverage.
And this is my last question for you.
Yeah.
Okay, so what, if any, structural improvements or reforms would you like to see take place, or do you think would be effective in creating a more healthy housing environment over the next 10 years?
I go back to the supply side. I think that demand side solutions, it's always great to see a focus on affordability, but I think we need to focus on the supply side of the equation a little bit more, because sometimes when you boost the demand side, you see that reflected in higher house prices, and that can contribute to declines in affordability. So, focusing on making it more cheaper and faster for builders to build more homes, some focusing on zoning and permitting and reducing the sort of barriers that we see there. The builders think of the 5 L's of factors like holding back more home building activity. Right. And so that's always what I come back to, is trying to tackle the supply side of the equation so we can bring more homes to the market. And with more supply on the market, you can get some downward pressure on prices, and I think contribute to a more affordable housing market and give people more options to choose from. So.
And you think that policy and zoning is probably, are those, I had a conversation earlier today, and when it came to building and the supply issue, was zoning and policy was brought up again. But what about cost of materials, labor? I mean, where, again, it's various factors at play, but in that supply, creating more homes and the supply problem, where do you see as the hierarchy of these two are the most important factors?
I do think that tackling zoning, and it's getting a lot more attention. There's been a ton of progress on focusing on zoning issues, and reducing permitting times and permitting costs. So I think on the regulation side, that's sort of where I would focus. But certainly there's been a skilled labor shortage in the construction industry since the end of the global financial crisis. And so I think getting more folks into the construction industry is another important factor to allowing builders to build more homes. Residential material costs are still over 40% higher than they were pre-pandemic. So I think that is, that's certainly a challenge as well. But it seems that from a policy perspective, that focusing on zoning and the regulation piece of all of these construction headwinds is a good one.
Excellent. All right. Odeta, thank you very much. It was
a
a pleasure.
pleasure.
Thank you for taking the time.
Thanks, sir.